Good morning, everyone. I'm a complete technophobe. And these kind of things happen whenever I'm using technology, whether it's me doing it or somebody else. So I'm just hoping this works. I'm really a people person, so it's very odd for me to sit in the corner of my bedroom talking for 90 minutes without direct feedback. So there is a chat box, and if possible, I will try and respond if anyone has comments or questions to make. This is a big topic, and I often spend a whole day training on this topic. I was in South Carolina in January, and I did a whole day on this topic. Trying to condense it into 90 minutes was very challenging. And yesterday I realized I had enough slides for about 6 hours. So I removed, I think, 21 of them. And then early this morning, I put 12 of them back because I didn't want to miss them out. So I'm going to go fairly quickly, but I'm glad it's being recorded because that will give you the opportunity, if you're interested, of going back and catching what I'm saying again. At the very end, I will give you my email address, and I'm very open to you emailing with questions or requests for information. I did send a reading list, and everything on the reading list is available online without any cost. And I would recommend you look through that reading list, and there's a couple of articles there by me that go into a lot more detail about this topic than I'll be able to do in this fairly short time of the webinar today. Very briefly, I should explain, as Marita said, I'm a teacher. I'm very much a practitioner. I'm not a researcher, and I'm not an academic. And I've been given awards for my research, which always amuses me because I'm a very disorganized thinker. But for 47 years, I've worked with a lot of children, and I'm a very good observer. It's the one skill that I have is meticulous observation. And that will be the main message today, is observe the children. Observe them more carefully than you have been doing. Think about what you're observing, share it with other people, and learn from your observations who the child is, but very much let the child show you who they are. And if this goes right this morning, by the end of this session, I will have answered questions like, why is this young man wearing his backpack on the top of his head, with the straps pulling up very tight under his armpits? Why is this his preferred way of doing it? Why is this boy wearing his t-shirt with the neck of the t-shirt over his head like a hood? And again, the t-shirt is now pulling up very, very hard under his armpits, another preferred posture. Why is this young man, who's doing an extraordinary forward handstand with his legs on the back of his chair, why is he in this position? In order to effectively look at his iPad and even move one hand over and extend his fingers to operate the touch screen in this position. Here's a child asleep. Why does she sleep on her back with her legs up against the side of the cot and one leg bent and the ankle of the other leg pressed very, very firmly on top of the knee of the other leg? A very, very common position for many of the children I work with, not just for sleeping. And why do babies who don't have cerebral palsy, why do they sometimes cross their fingers at a very early age? This photograph is a child who's not even 1 year old and often crosses his fingers. It's a voluntary behavior. It's quite deliberate. And like all these photographs, if you can't answer the question, why are they doing this? That should be your goal, to find out why they're doing it. Because what they're showing us is specific difficulties they're dealing with and their solutions to those difficulties. And the last photo to begin with, squeezing into tight spaces. Again, a very common behavior. And the heading at the top, this comes from a different talk I give, but very often the behaviors I'm showing you in these photographs are perceived as signs of autism. This comes up again and again and again when I'm in the days when I was going around to schools and homes. And I think it's useful to bring that up right from the beginning, because to say he's doing this because he's autistic is a dead end to me. He's actually doing it for quite specific reasons. And it's those reasons we need to explore and ascertain, because they then open the door to future working strategies for us.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
I look at those photographs and I have the idea of sensory diet in my mind. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept. It comes from the occupational therapy world. And it's basically, what it means is looking at what children are doing, as in those photographs, and saying to yourself, what sensory input is the child giving themselves? What sensory input are they trying to intensify or create? And analyzing their behaviors in terms of the sensory inputs they are trying to give themselves. And then asking the question, why would they be looking for that particular sensory input in that particular situation? And that will be the main theme of this talk this morning. So that was just by way of introduction. It's good to remember that everything joins up. We human beings are very reductive. We like to simplify everything and categorize. And we talk about vision and hearing and mobility and cognitive skills as if they're all separate, but of course they all overlap and they're all involved with each other. And I've made this list of big topics like self-determination, sensory perception, emotional competence, self-regulation, executive function, availability for learning, expectations and motivators, because all these things come into play when we're trying to assess a student and evaluate who they are and where they are. And sometimes it's good to be reminded that it's very much more complicated than it might seem. I've got a quote from one of the great names in the field, Natalie Barriger, who was a vision teacher and really one of the great gurus of her time. And I've underlined some of the words in this quote. She says, visual functioning is related in part to the condition of the eye. And obviously we're aware of that. But then she goes on, more explicitly, visual functioning, and remember she's talking about function here. Visual functioning is determined by the experiences, motivations, needs, and expectations of each individual in relation to whatever visual capacity is available to satisfy curiosity and accomplish activities for personal satisfaction. What she's saying is there are many, many factors involved in the way we use our sensory systems and the way we understand our sensory systems. And it isn't just a case of clinical evaluation of those systems, looking at the sensory receptors, looking at the nerve pathways, looking at the brain for the areas where those sensory inputs are normally received and processed and interpreted. And the words I've picked out to me, they're all part of the emotional heart of the child. So looking at this quote, it helps us understand why if you go into a room of children with visual impairments, the child with the best functional vision might be the most blind in the group. The clinical information might not necessarily tell you the hierarchy of functional ability in those students. And it's just the same with hearing. In a room of deaf children, the child with the best articulated speech might be the deafest child in the room. So again, there are many, many factors involved in the way children function and the way they do things or don't do things. People like to focus on children's disabilities. I see this all the time in special education. And I'm always saying to people, close attention to the child's abilities, and especially to the things they do, all by themselves, spontaneously. Paying attention to the things they do can reveal more about the difficulties they face and the strategies they use to function effectively. So for me, if I'm assessing a child, I usually go in with these thoughts in my mind. I want to know how the child's feeling. Is this a good day or a bad day? Have they been ill? Did they have a bad night and didn't sleep well? Or are they working on a fairly good optimal level? And then what do they like? Because I'm a teacher, I'm interested in motivators because that's what I will use in order to build a relationship with the child. And then what do you want? And what that means is, what range of expressive behavior does the child have that answers that question? Can I tell when this child has had enough of playing with me? Can I tell when the child wants her mom? Can I tell when the child wants the toy that's on the shelf just in front of her? Can I tell when the child wants me to hold her hand or let go of her hand? How easy is it to read the child in terms of their current expressive behavior? And then my fourth question is, what do you do? And as a teacher, I have a fifth question, which is, what can you do? And that's the one where people tend to begin their assessment. They often come in with that question as the first question in their mind. And I like to think that comes a little way down the road, because first I'm interested in what this child does, maybe all by themselves when they're just amusing themselves and keeping themselves entertained. And what do you do, I think, will give you an awful lot of information towards completing a successful assessment of the child. Everything children with deafblindness do has meaning, and that's an important thing to remember. The first obligation in the teacher is to ascertain that meaning, or at least come up with a really good guess, often by sharing with other people, with family members, with colleagues, with other professionals in the child's team, and then test your guess. You've got a hypothesis, you test it to see if it looks as if you're right. And when people say, you know, how often have you heard people say about children you work with, she does crazy things, or I don't know why he does that, it's mad. And I always think, well, it's probably not mad and it's probably not crazy. There's probably an explanation. And if we could find the explanation, maybe we could then work out where to go next. If it's just crazy, what are you going to do about it? That doesn't open any doors into the future. And of course, I've been in the deafblind field a long time. And when I started in England, the deafblind children I worked with were fairly straightforward. It's strange looking back. We thought they were complex and a puzzle, but now they seem fairly straightforward. And the whole field has got much more complicated. And deafblindness now involves many more senses than just vision and hearing. And it's no longer adequate to just think about the tactile sense as a compensatory channel to use because of the child's visual and hearing difficulties. And I'll get onto the senses in a moment, but I think it's also helpful to remember that the brain is connected to the body through the senses. The function of the senses is to keep the brain informed about where it is, what it's doing, what's happening around it, what it needs to do, what it has done, and whether it's been successful or not. And if you take the senses away, the brain is completely helpless. And because most of the children that we see now have difficulties with many sensory systems, I believe their brains are not in touch with their bodies very effectively. And a lot of their behaviors, a lot of their postural behaviors, a lot of their self-stimulation behaviors are actually their attempts to get their brains in better contact with their bodies so that they can function more effectively. And when people talk to me about communication, they usually mean communication and language. I think of it more in terms of a hierarchy, beginning with communication with one's own body. I observe children and I'm saying to myself, how well does this boy's brain communicate with his body? And what's he doing to improve that or to make it more effective? If the brain isn't communicating with the body effectively, it's not going to be available for communicating with the environment outside the body. Because the priority will be, where is my body? What is my body doing? Is my body safe? If that first step is taken care of, and the brain-body connection is working reasonably well, then the brain can be available for the outside world and the outside environment. So, the senses. We all grew up, I'm sure, hearing about the 5 senses. And I like to say, well, let's think about the 7 senses. And of course, there are other senses. Perception of temperature is a sense. A perception of pain is another sense. But on this slide, I've included the 2 that I'm going to talk about today, the vestibular sense and the proprioceptive sense, because they tend to get very overlooked. Here is a pyramid of learning. It's a diagram in the shape of a pyramid. And at the bottom, the foundation is the central nervous system, or the brain and the spinal cord. And at the very bottom, the foundation is the sensory systems. As I just said, they are crucially important. And then, assuming the sensory systems are present and working in some way, the child can move on to sensory motor development and eventually perceptual motor development. And then the goal of education, cognition and intellect. And at the very top of the pyramid is academic learning, which is like the Valhalla or the El Dorado of education. And unfortunately, in the education world, the people who call the shots, who are mostly politicians and bureaucrats, they think education is only about academic learning. And our job is to keep making sure that we're going right to the bottom of the pyramid and getting that foundation secure. Doing it from the beginning with young children, but doing it possibly in every interaction with a child, even if that child is now a teenager, or even if they're no longer a child and they're an adult. We might need to help them get this stable base before we move on to higher functioning. If you look at the sensory systems, you'll see they're on 2 levels. And the bottom level is touch, vestibular, and proprioception. And then you've got smell, vision, hearing, and taste on top of them. And what the design is telling us is that touch, vestibular, and proprioception are actually foundationally more important. They are providing a secure environment for those other sensory systems to develop and function. And these 2 senses, I call them the forgotten senses because they're often overlooked. Proprioception, the receptors are in the muscles and the joints throughout the body. And this is a sense that tells us about the position of our body and all of our limbs, and if any part of our body is moving or stationary. The vestibular sense is much more complicated and actually much more important. The receptors are in the inner ears on both sides of the head, and this is the sense that tells us lots of things, but mainly it tells us about head position. It tells us about the pull of gravity. It detects head motion, and it has very close links with the eyes and vision, as I will explain in a little while. I'm skipping slides here like crazy. So the proprioceptive sense helps us to plan and position and grade our movements without looking to see what we're doing. When we walk in an automatic way because proprioception is guiding our movements. We don't have to look down at our feet to see what they're doing. It happens in an automatic way. But if you work with people who have very poor proprioceptive perception, they may well demonstrate a whole range of behaviors like foot stamping or sliding the feet along the floor or going up onto tippy toe to tighten the muscles in the feet, the calf, the thigh, and even the butt, tightening those muscle groups to create more proprioceptive input so that their brain knows where their legs and their feet are more effectively. As I said, the receptors are based all through the joints and the muscles of the body. And what triggers them is 3 things, basically. Anything which stretches a part of the body, anything which compresses, and anything that twists. So stretching, compressing, and twisting all fire up the proprioceptive receptors to send messages to the brain saying, this is what's happening to that particular part of the body. And if this sense is working well, our brains are constantly aware of the position of all our body parts and whether they're moving or not. If children don't have good proprioceptive perception, we see a whole range of features. They may have postural insecurity. They may like to be flat on the floor, not resisting gravity. They may have very low muscle tone, which is often the case. They may be very clumsy in their movements. And they may demonstrate a whole range of self-stimulation behaviors which are designed to give them proprioceptive input. Proprioception goes wrong for a whole range of reasons. A significant injury, like a broken bone or a ripped tendon. Orthopedic surgery can at least temporarily impede proprioceptive perception. Arthritis is a problem. In cerebral palsy, proprioceptive perception is often not working properly. And in fact, any abnormal muscle tone will get in the way of good proprioceptive input. So if the muscle tone tends to be too low and the body is very floppy, or too high and the body is stiff, then the proprioceptive system won't be getting the signals that it needs for the brain to know where the body is. The one we've all experienced, of course, is poor circulation, where you sit on a leg watching television, your leg goes to sleep, and the doorbell rings and it's difficult to walk. You've still got a leg and a foot, you know where they are, you know how to walk, but you can't feel that joint, which makes walking a great challenge. So poor circulation, sometimes associated with heart defects, can affect proprioceptive perception. And like all our senses, lack of use leads to poor perception. So if for some reason the child is not moving, if they're understimulated, if they're very sick, struggling to breathe, frequent hospitalizations, all these things will get in the way of the system working effectively. I mentioned self-stimulation behaviors. These are some of the most common that we see, and I'm sure if you think about children you're working with, you'll immediately picture specific children from this list. Looking for strong pressure, stretching or twisting, squeezing into tight spaces, crossing or twisting limbs around each other, twisting a foot or a leg around the leg of a chair, binding parts of the body with cloth or string or rubber bands, pulling downwards on the teeth or the lower jaw, grinding the teeth. The jaw is a source of powerful proprioceptive input. One of the strongest places in the body where you can give your brain strong pressure information. And it's not surprising we should see a lot of these mouth-based behaviors in children with these problems. Tapping on the teeth, hand clapping or hand flapping. This hand flapping is my favorite self-stim behavior. I'm always thrilled when I see a child do it. Leg swinging or kicking, hanging from a bar, either by the hands or with the arms over the bar or the belly over the bar, jumping up and down, banging the head, hammering objects, or standing on the head, all these kinds of behaviors. Here's a young teenager I met a long time ago, one of my teachers. Very low tone, completely blind, profoundly deaf. He's had very poor education. He has very low affect, no language, minimal communication behaviors. His mother has led him with great difficulty to the swing. She's put his hand on the swing. He screamed and dropped to the floor and curled into a fetal position. His mother's walked away and immediately he's lifted his hand, located the swing, pulled himself up with two arms onto the swing, dropped forwards into the position you see in the photo. And then he's meticulously, by moving his toes to swing, he's moved his body back and forwards on the swing until it's in just the right place for security, so he won't fall. And once it's right, he pulls one arm out of the sleeve of his t-shirt and he squeezes it into the other sleeve. It's much too tight, which is the whole point. And I'm watching this with my mouth wide open because this kid is giving us a perfect demonstration of if you can't feel your body effectively, what kinds of things can you do so that you do start to feel where it is more effectively. And once everything was in place, he starts to move his feet and he enjoys almost 10 minutes of swinging in this rather unusual position. Now, you can look at that and say he's crazy. You can say he's mentally retarded, he's autistic, he's emotionally disturbed. Or you can say, what kind of sensory input is he looking for? Because he wouldn't go to these lengths unless he needed those inputs. My agency got involved, and it was actually my boss became the deafblind specialist. And here's the same boy exactly 1 year later. He's getting regular deep pressure massage. He's wearing a pressure vest and pressure cuffs around his knees and his elbows. He's wearing heavier shoes. He's going on therapeutic horse riding at the weekends. He's going swimming in a hydrotherapy pool twice a week. There's a whole lot of strategies have evolved from this awareness that he's not feeling his body effectively. And what you've now got is a boy whose brain is no longer saying, where's my body, where's my body? So it's available for social interaction with his family around him. Here's a child who can't yet stand unsupported, low tone, and here's self-stimulation behavior. We have to remember that posture is part of self-stimulation. It isn't just about biting fingers or flapping hands or guttural vocalization. These are self-stimulation behaviors. These are children trying to create sensory stimulation for some reason or other, either because they need it or because they like it. And usually it's both. They like it because they need it and because they can get it for themselves. And you imagine the immense tactile, but especially pressure input this girl is giving herself through this behavior. Here's a young baby doing it. This photo came in an email to me. You know, isn't this weird? We can't get him to bear weight on his legs. He gets very upset, but he can do this. And it's kind of paradoxical because we think this is more advanced than weight bearing. But if you've got the kind of issues these children have, especially with vestibular dysfunction, then this is going to be a more reliable, less threatening posture than weight bearing upright against gravity. Here is a classic sleep posture. Notice the bent leg again, which you've already seen once, one ankle up on the other knee. Notice also both hands are back underneath the child, so they're getting compressed. And I think this is a classic sleep posture because the brain needs to know that the body is secure, not moving, and not going to fall. And once all that is confirmed, the child is free to fall asleep. This child also likes their face covered. Here's a boy who won't sit on a swing. It's way too threatening, but he can do this. Now, I couldn't do that in a million years. I'd be quite injured, but I'm not him. And it's good to remember that what we think about as hierarchical development, these children can completely upend that hierarchy for very good reasons. And it isn't crazy, and it isn't autistic, and it isn't retardation. Here's a young lady I used to work with. She comes home from school. She's pretty over the top, very, very active, hyperventilating. She likes to move the couch a little way from the wall and then let gravity drop her down in the space to get compression. And you see her feeding tube is there under pressure. And here's a boy who's supposed to be watching a video and has a much better use for the video TV setup, which is squeezing into a narrow space. So that was a quick rush through proprioception. I hope it made sense. I'm going to now move on to the vestibular sense. And in the reading list I've given you, there is an article I wrote about proprioception, and there's a much longer article I wrote about the vestibular sense. So I'd recommend, if you want more information, they would be a good place to start. The vestibular sense is much more complicated. As I said, it tells us about head position. It detects head motion, and it has very close links with the eyes and the visual sense, and also with proprioception. And something I learned a long time ago is that teachers of the deaf often use the visual sense a lot with their deaf students, but the teachers get no training in vision and the way vision develops and visual difficulties and visual impairments. And just the same, I discovered that vision teachers who rely a lot on the child's hearing get no training in hearing and the way that hearing develops and the things that can go wrong with it. And I was very surprised when I learned about the vestibular sense, because I'd had some training in vision and low vision, and no one had ever mentioned the vestibular sense to me. And it's very important. So in this diagram, oh, someone's just asking me for the reading list. And I know that you have the reading list, and that will be made available to people. So you will be able to get it. If anyone has a real problem, just email me and I can send it to you. What this slide shows is what should be in the inner ear on both sides of the head. It's greatly enlarged. And in reality, of course, this is very, very small and very delicate and very fragile. And what you've got is a very complex system of structures which are all hollow and filled with fluid. And on the inside of those structures, there are lots of nerve hairs which are activated when the fluid moves. At the top, you've got the cochlea, the thing that looks like a snail shell, which is the organ of hearing. And then below that, everything else is the vestibular apparatus. There are two bulbs, the saccule and the utricle. And then you've got these three big curved pipes called the semicircular canals. And that vestibular apparatus, different parts are activated when the head moves in different ways. So when you go up and down in an elevator, one of the bulbs is activated. When you move forwards, when you're walking, or you're driving in a car, or you're moving in an airplane, the other bulb is activated for horizontal, linear movement. And then the semicircular canals, there are three of them in a particular configuration. One of them is activated when your head goes yes. One is activated when your head goes no. And one is activated when your head moves in a diagonal direction. And remember, this is replicated on the other side of the head as well. And all together, that apparatus, when it's working, tells us all the time where our head is and what our head is doing. And it can go wrong for all sorts of reasons. As I said, all these structures are very fragile and easily damaged. And children can have vestibular dysfunction for a whole range of reasons. This is a list I started to make, then I stopped. I filled up the slide and I didn't look anymore, but I think these are the main ones. Head and neck trauma, usually during or after birth. Chronic ear infections, especially if they're not treated, can lead to permanent damage to both the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus. And we know that if we get an ear infection, there may be temporary disruption of our vestibular functioning. I don't know if you've experienced that, but I certainly have. Maternal drug or alcohol abuse during pregnancy can damage the vestibular development in the fetus. If the mother during pregnancy is infected with cytomegalovirus, that virus can damage the fetus very severely, including the development of the vestibular apparatus. Meningitis infection, if the child survives, they may well survive with all sorts of brain damage, including vestibular dysfunction. Migraine can cause temporary vestibular dysfunction. I don't know if any of you get migraine. I don't, but I'm told people often need to lie down because they're afraid of falling. And there is all sorts of visual disturbance, like the visual field starts to move, or everything goes blue, or something like that. Metabolic disorders, if they're not treated, so long-term untreated diabetes, we know can result in a whole range of serious issues, including permanent vestibular dysfunction. The use of ototoxic drugs, like in a meningitis infection, for example, those drugs can help to fight the infection and can save the life, but they can damage all that apparatus in the inner ear as a side effect. A posterior brain tumor may well damage the parts of the brain that process vestibular input. Then there are certain neurological disorders like cerebral palsy and hydrocephalus. Then there are the genetic syndromes, and the three main ones are Wallenberg, Usher, type 1. There are 3 types of Usher syndrome. Type 1 has vestibular dysfunction from, I believe, from birth. And the big one is Charge syndrome. And I've worked with many, many children with Charge syndrome in my career. And we think about at least 95% of people with Charge are born with significant vestibular dysfunction. And if you scan the inner ear, quite often it will show that the semicircular canals are completely missing. They never developed. Or little bits of them are there, but not the rest. If there's a family history of vestibular issues, it might well come out in the child. There's a little bit of evidence of cochlear implants. When they are first activated, the child who didn't have vestibular dysfunction before might develop it afterwards. But there's also at least one case where a child who had vestibular dysfunction was fitted with a cochlear implant, and it improved the vestibular system functioning. And finally, again, lack of use. If there are movement issues, fear of movement and anxiety, lots of ill health, lack of motivation to resist gravity, then this system will not work and develop very effectively. Now, I mentioned there were strong links between vision and the vestibular sense, and I'm going to talk about 2 aspects of that in particular. I'll just have a drink here. I'm realizing now I should have had my breakfast before I started this morning because I'm 2 hours behind you. First of all, how do we achieve balance? We know that balance or equilibrium is a function of the vestibular system, but actually it's a bit more complicated, and that's good news. There are actually 3 sensory systems that contribute to the development of good equilibrium or balance: vision, proprioception, and vestibular. Or as I put here, input from the eyes, input from the muscles and joints, and input from the vestibular organs. And people forget how big a part vision plays in attaining balance and maintaining balance. And you realize it when you work, for example, with a child with Charge syndrome who has very severe vestibular dysfunction. If that child is walking, and walking tends to develop very late in that population for fairly obvious reasons, but most children with Charge do get up and walk eventually. They might be 5 years old or 7 or 12 or 16, but the vast majority of those children do stand and walk. They are very distinct walking styles because of their multisensory disabilities. But you see how, if you observe them closely, you see how much they're relying on their residual vision to help them maintain their balance against gravity. One of the issues in charge is coloboma. Part of the retina is missing, and it tends to be the bottom of the retina that's missing, which means that it's the top of the visual field that's missing. So those children don't have a visual field up here. So in order to look into the distance, they have to do this. They have to lift the chin and put the head back. And if you watch when they're walking, they will often fixate on an object in the distance. They'll look at the doorway or the clock on the wall or a picture on the wall. And then they start to walk. And these are children who don't fall over things, generally speaking, in a familiar environment. In an unfamiliar environment, they may well fall over something as big as a coffee table, because that residual visual field, the whole of it is being used to visually hold on to that target to keep themselves upright and stable. There's no visual attention being paid down here to what's on the floor. And I've had a huge number of people tell me that they're confused because the clinical evidence says the child has no upper visual field, but they seem to have no lower field because they fall over things on the floor. And I think that's the most likely explanation why it happens. So if the child has vestibular dysfunction, if they have low muscle tone and their proprioceptive and tactile perception isn't good, any work we do to improve functional vision is a contribution towards achieving better balance and maintaining better posture, and one day hopefully getting up and walking. You know, it's good to remember that working on a child's early visual skills is a contribution to walking, even though we might not be generally thinking of it in that way. The other way that the vestibular sense relates to vision is particularly important and particularly interesting. And this is something every vision teacher should be told at the moment they go into training for the profession. We have a reflex called the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And as the title makes fairly clear, this is a reflex that links the vestibular system with the vision system. And I looked up a clinical definition, and this is the clinical definition. I'll put it into proper English in a moment. In normal head movement, the eyes move in the opposite direction of the head and at the same speed to stabilize the retinal image. Now let's think what that means. The retinal image means the thing you are looking at. So let's assume that I'm looking at the screen and I'm looking at the title of this slide, the vestibulo-ocular reflex. I want to remain looking at that, but I'm going to move my head in many, many different directions at many different speeds. And the wonderful thing is, although when I move my head, my eyes are going with it, my visual fixation is constant. I don't lose what I'm looking at because of my vestibular sense. It's my vestibular sense that allows me to keep my eyes fixed on something when my body and my head and my eyes are moving around in space. If you take my vestibular sense away, first of all, I'd be holding onto this chair because I'd be scared of falling. But assuming I wasn't concerned about posture, The moment I move my head up, my eyes go up and I lose what I'm looking at and I have to search for it again. The moment my head turns to the right, I've lost it and I have to move my eyes to relocate. When you look at children using their vision, sometimes you may find that they're having to do things to stabilize the head. You may find that they're having to do this, put the elbows on the desk and do this. You may find that they're doing this. You may find that they're putting their chin on the table, or even that they're laying their head with the ear down on the table and they're holding the book. Instead of holding the book the right way up, they're turning it sideways so they can look at it. I don't know if you see that, but I see that fairly often. And here are some children. These are all children with Charge syndrome in these pictures. This child is starting to develop an interest in books. Low tone, not yet walking. I believe she was weight bearing against a couch at this stage. Interestingly, if she found something she wanted to look at, especially long visual scrutiny, where it's not just a glance, but you want to have a good look. And you may also want to do visually directed reach and manipulation. The first thing she does is roll onto her back, get the body and the head as stable as possible. Then bring one ankle up on the other knee to confirm no need to pay attention to physical safety because everything's fixed. Then you can start to use your vision for the thing you want it for in this situation. Here's a teenager I used to work with. She's 14, I think. She's walking. She's a quite impressive American Sign Language user. She's profoundly deaf. She's blind in one eye, and she has quite a small area of lower visual field in the right eye only. So very little visual field. Her acuity isn't bad for near work. She's developed an interest in books and detail in books. She's in a deaf program for children with additional disabilities. And I was actually contacted because there were big behavioral issues. She developed this interest in books. And every day in the classroom, when it was library time, the children would select some books and go to their desks. She would take the books and lie on her back on the floor in this position. And because she's 14, this was not socially appropriate. So they would lift her up with the books and put her on her chair, and she would get upset. And when they walked away, she would get the books and go back on the floor. And she was sending out a very clear message. She wasn't avoiding the activity. In fact, she was doing the activity. But the school didn't understand what the issue was. And they phoned me. I knew the teachers. There were two teachers. And I was able to schedule a visit, and I went down a week or so later. And when I explained the situation, within a few days, they obtained a couch in the classroom. It was for all the students to use, but at library time, only the student was allowed on the couch. And they took this photo less than a week after I visited the school. And they said, it's perfect. It's perfectly appropriate for her to lie on the couch in this position. And what you see is you stabilize the body and the head. You bring the ankle up on the other knee to confirm everything's fixed. And then she would push two fingers against her lip, against the lower teeth, push very hard as an additional way of stabilizing the head, so that that one eye with a little bit of vision could do the work it needed to do to look at the book. At that stage, she was looking at pictures. Here's a really smart adaptation. This is a young man. He's on the couch. He's got up on all fours and he's resting his forehead on the armrest at the end of the couch. It's just brilliant. And then in that position, not only has he stabilized the visual field for looking at his tablet, but he's also secure enough to bring one hand up and use it to operate the tablet and do the things he wants to do. And this reminds me of a really good point. These behaviors are self-discovered. These behaviors are self-initiated, and we need to respect that and credit that. We don't know how the children manage it. How do they learn to bring one ankle up on the other knee to confirm that your body is safe? There's such a driving need in these brains to get that security and that safety fixed in their heads. And rather than don't sit like that, sit up, take your elbows off the desk, the response should be, why does he need his elbows on the desk? And what can we do about it? And maybe we should consult with the PT or the OT or the vision teacher or the mom and dad to pool ideas and work something out. And then here's a fairly new picture. I don't know how well you can see this. He's flat on his back. He's got both legs extended almost straight. He's braced his hands around the back of the knees, and the pad, he's watching a little cartoon, and the tablet is held between his toes, prehensile feet. And that, again, it's rare, but I've seen many children use their feet and their toes rather like hands and fingers. And the message here is you fix the body to fix the head, to fix the eyes, so you can use your vision in the best, most reliable, and most comfortable way possible. And if you don't take away anything else from my webinar, I hope that at least will stay with you. And again, this is from an article I wrote about vision issues for children with charge. When people think about muscular activities, they usually think of things like aerobics, weightlifting, swimming, hiking, wrestling, and so on. But they rarely think about using vision, even though vision is a sense that depends upon very good control and coordination of many different muscle groups if it is to be used effectively. You can use your hearing in any position. You can use your hearing to listen to something in the next room. You can't do that with vision. The eyes have to be oriented in the right direction for the right amount of time. Otherwise, functional vision won't be there and won't be doing its job. It's an intensely muscular activity, and it imposes big demands on the individual. And the individual then will do what they can to achieve these things. And I've put the word comfortable in because vision drives posture. If the child is having to adopt fairly undesirable postures in order to use their vision, we need to get in there and start helping them use their vision in more desirable postures. We don't want the children developing significant contractures over time because they've permanently been holding their heads in strange positions. I have a story. Back in the early 80s, I had an accident to my left eye and effectively blinded myself. And I still have a good right eye. And almost 20 years later, I did a gym class, an aerobics class, and at the end we had to lie face down, and I discovered I could turn my head completely to the right face down with no problem, but I can only turn it halfway to the left because ever since I lost the vision in this eye in 1983, I've been holding my head slightly over to the left in order to bring my right visual field more central. It's very minor. I didn't know I was doing it. No one ever commented on it. But now I'm left with a contracture where I can't turn the head fully in that direction. It isn't a problem, but it just makes the point that if the child's putting their head in and their body in bad positions for lots of the time, we need to intervene and try and help that. I'm sure you know about this, but even the eyes themselves rely on muscles. It's not just about the body and the head, but these muscles extend from good accommodation, where the lens in the eye can be pulled and relaxed in order to help us accommodate at different distances, to the ocular muscles, all the way through to the other muscle groups in the body, because vision drives posture. It's a postural sense in a way that hearing is not. But the obverse is also true, and posture can drive vision. And I just want to make some brief points. These diagrams are from a very good monograph that came from Australia a long time ago. It's long out of print. Tricia Geniale is a physical therapist in Australia. She worked specifically with children with deafblindness, and she wrote a monograph about visual issues in children with cerebral palsy. And what these line drawings show, this is someone with high muscle tone, spasticity. If you lay that child on their front on the floor, they're going to go involuntarily into this high extension. And Tricia makes the point that when the body goes into that high extension, the eyes get forced to the top of the eye socket, and it's almost impossible to bring them down. So you've immediately limited the range of eye movement that's available. And one of the things she suggests is in the bottom diagram, where you lie the child with their chest on a wedge, and then gravity helps to break the extension and pull the head down in a more flexed position, and immediately the eyes then have a greater range of movement within the eye sockets. And then she talks about children with abnormally low tone. The top picture shows a child sitting on a chair, not the right kind of chair, and clearly slumping under gravity into extreme flexion. With this child, one idea might be to lie them on their back, reclined on a wedge. So now you're breaking the flexion by using gravity to get them more extended again. So the eyes are no longer locked in the bottom of the eye sockets. And then she talks, for example, about positioning work and how the position in which you place work on the table can facilitate functional vision or can inhibit it. And vision teachers are well aware of that, but it can be a specific issue in children with cerebral palsy and particular kinds of orthopedic disability. I'm aware I'm going very quickly. I'm okay for time. We have 20 minutes, so I hope you're holding on. The nice thing is you can all go away and snooze or have a drink, and I can't see you. You can see me. So as I said, children often adopt specific postures, horizontal with both legs bent, one ankle up on the other knee, legs tightly crossed, fingers crossed, hands fisted. These postures provide essential extra tactile and pressure information to the brain about where the child's limbs are in space, and also confirms for them that they are securely fixed and not moving or floating around. These postural behaviors have always been present, but largely unseen. When they are noticed, there is often amusement because the postures seem weird, or the child is corrected with no attempt to understand or recognize or honor what the posture means and what function it serves. And we're back to that very important point. The children do this themselves, and very, very often they do it in order to function as effectively as they can. And we need to understand, recognize, and honor that, but we can then intervene to get things different with the child's cooperation once we've built a relationship. And here is an old picture of a boy at a conference I went to, watching a cartoon on the television. And I say, it's normal viewing posture. He's on the edge of the couch, hanging upside down. When you have no vestibular sense, upper visual field loss, poor tactile and proprioceptive perception, and low muscle tone. He's found a way of removing the challenges of gravity whilst allowing him to keep his head absolutely stable. It's just hanging in space with no movement. So he's actually using gravity to effect that stability. Very creative. Who taught him this? Nobody. He did it himself. Well, because the vestibular sense tells us about head position and head movement, that question, where is my head, is present in children's minds much of the time, I believe. And they have to come up with all these kinds of strategies in order to answer that question. We see dramatic head weaving, often in a figure of 8. And I see, you know, when children start to do unusual behaviors, when they start to self-stimulate, other people are often very quick to intervene. And the goal is to stop the behavior, where the goal should be to understand the behavior so that we can help them get what they're looking for in a different way, in a better way, in a more open, ongoing way, or a safer way. So head weaving serves a function. In some children, of course, with very reduced vision field, that kind of scanning behavior is seen. This is more like head weaving, which doesn't relate so much to visual input, but is a way of increasing the amount of information coming through the proprioceptors in the shoulders and the neck, and whatever visual functioning is happening in order to answer the question. We see head binding, tight hats, sweatbands put around the head, string, boxes and buckets pulled on the head. We see head holding or head tapping or putting the head against the desk and tapping. Head pressing or standing on the head. Some of these children are brilliant at head standing in spite of their postural challenges. Jaw clenching, teeth grinding, and biting and chewing. I have a great collection of kids with objects wedged on their head. They're not just sitting on the head, but you see the child pulling them as hard as they can. And then you might, not in this case, but you might see that children's walking, their gait and their posture is much improved when they've got something tight on their head, because then their brain has a much better idea where their head is. So it's much less likely to flop around with the rest of the body following suit. There's more and more of a market now for these oral stimulation objects. These are the kerchiefs. You often see children with their blouse or their sweater in their mouth, sometimes holes in where they've bitten right through the fabric or the wool, sometimes soaked in saliva. And now children have these kerchiefs. And now there's a whole range of these kind of rather attractive silicone things for the children to bite on. And it's good to remember that deep pressure is very calming. So a lot of the behaviors you've seen in the photographs are self-regulating, as well as answering those questions. Where is my body? Am I safe? Will I fall? Where's my head? Those postures are very often helping the children to wake up, or especially to calm down. Once you've confirmed your body's safe and you're not going to fall, automatically your arousal level is probably going to come down, and your brain then is freed up, because we're also thinking of availability of the brain for learning through the other sensory systems. And many children walk better when they've got something clenched in their mouth. And rather than think of it as oral stimulation, I like to think of it as proprioceptive stimulation. It happens to be in the mouth, but it's as proprioceptive as bringing one ankle up on the other knee, or folding the hands in all those kind of ways that we see children doing. I've shown you lots of these postures, but I sometimes do a talk where I take each of these bullet points in turn and show different photographs to back up the point I'm making. I can't do that today, there's no time. But I've already talked about falling asleep, the need to get the body and the head fully supported, which we all need, but then the need to do something with the legs in order to confirm to the brain it's okay to go to sleep. Here's someone who's also bringing the arms into play. So remember that proprioception isn't just compression, but it's stretching. So at the top of her body, she's getting pretty massive stretching proprioceptive information. And down below, she's getting pretty massive compression proprioceptive information. Prehensile feet, as I said. We often see children clenching and fisting. Here's somebody who can actually clench his toes together. And here's a boy at the swimming pool, and his mother, she took this picture just for me. She suddenly noticed that he'd worked out he could weave his legs in and out of the rubber slats on the sun lounger, and then he could lay back and relax and calm down. So the functions of these postures, I think this is a short list, to help the brain locate the body, especially to help the brain locate the head, where everything is, to confirm postural security, to stabilize the body, to stabilize the head, to stabilize the eyes for visual tasks. And sometimes they may go into extreme extension to ease the discomfort of chronic constipation. This is a population where chronic constipation is particularly common. Sometimes they may be going into extension to open the airway if there are breathing difficulties. And for all these children, I think they use posture very often as a way of self-regulating. And that shouldn't surprise us, because we all use posture and other self-stimulation behaviors to self-regulate. In fact, the main point of self-stimulation is to self-regulate. And it isn't a bad thing that has to be stopped. Sometimes it gets dangerous or self-injurious. That's different, but it didn't start like that. And we have to think about the function of these behaviors rather than how can we stop them. And as you gather, I think posture is very much a self-stimulation behavior. And I also think postural behaviors are self-regulation behaviors. I don't have any problem with thinking that way, and I think it's helpful. And I have a quote from one of my gurus, is Jean Ayres, who was the occupational therapist who came up with the theory of sensory integration. And from that, she developed the therapy approach known as sensory integration therapy. And this is a really smart quote. After air to breathe, postural security is our next most urgent priority. And what she's saying is, if you put that child on a chair and they don't feel physically secure, they don't know that they're safe, they are not going to look, they're not going to listen, they're not going to pick up your communication, because their brain is programmed to address the potential insecurity of their body under gravity. And we're all the same. If we're talking as we walk along and we trip and fall, none of us continues talking as we go down to the floor. What happens is the vestibular sense has another reflex, not the vestibulo-ocular reflex, but the saving reflex or the self-protection reflex, which means if you fall forwards, your vestibular reflex makes you do this to stop your head hitting the floor. If you go sideways, it does this. You put your hands that side and you turn your head away from the direction in which you're falling. So if the child isn't feeling that their body is safe and secure, you need to help them feel that first, possibly in every interaction, before they will be available. And I mean, in London, we used to assess, we were partly an assessment centre, and mostly younger children, birth to 5. We assessed so many children's vision and hearing with them flat on their back, or butt scooting around the room, or underneath the table or the chair, because that's where their brain was feeling most secure and therefore was most available to stimuli in the environment, like me using something to see if they could visually fixate or track, or our teacher, the deaf, using the free field audiometer or whatever. What kinds of things help? This is a very quick list. Anything which improves muscle tone and controlled movement, anything which reinforces the body-brain connection. Examples might be Tai Chi, which can be adapted, yoga, climbing, dancing, deep pressure inputs like jumping, massage, trampolining might be a possibility, swimming, binding, like spandex pressure vests, the kinds of things OTs might recommend, along with, say, a brushing program. Good physical supports and appropriate postures for efficient functioning. So what kind of seating is provided for the child? You know, seating can make all the difference in the world to a child's behavior and to their academic development and to relationship building with other people. Lots of variety in postures and movement. Horse riding is absolutely brilliant for children with significant vestibular dysfunction and low tone and poor tactile and proprioception. If you can get to therapeutic horse riding, it's one of the most powerful things you can provide. Regular rest periods for reorganization, remembering that this population, their idea of rest might be running around in circles for 10 minutes. It doesn't necessarily mean lying down. Controlled environments, allowing the child's self-taught strategies, but teaching them new ones, and using an appropriate vocabulary in early language work for body parts, physical feelings, and emotional states. And I won't, we're running out of time, so I just want to show 2 last slides. Why do I think this is important and worth doing a webinar about? First of all, the things I've told you are there to help us to understand the child's challenges, to help us to gain a more accurate idea of the child's needs, to appreciate the child's adaptive behaviors and why they're happening and what they mean. And from that, this helps us to be able to introduce the essential child to other people in a positive way. to be aware of the fundamentally important things which often get overlooked or forgotten, to remember that everything the child does takes more time, more planning, more energy, more concentration, and more attention than it does for other children. And finally, to realize that things that look crazy might really be functional and clever adaptations. For me, there's nothing nicer than meeting a family and seeing the child doing some of these postural things I've described, or movement things, and the family see them as really crazy, wacky things. Oh, they lie. Oh, she does that all the time. She's nuts. And I then come in and I say, I think she's getting this, and I think she needs it because of that. And let's look at her before she does that and afterwards and see if that improves things. Let's see how she uses her hands and eyes together when she's upright compared to when she's on her back. Or let's see how she uses her hands and eyes together when she's been sitting for a while. How well does she use her hands and eyes together when we've just given her a deep pressure massage, or we've just been on the trampoline or whatever. And when those parents then email me with a photo of their child doing one of these crazy things, it happened to me yesterday, and the mom sent me a video and she said, thanks to you, I realize everything he's doing in this video is looking for strong proprioceptive input to work out where his body is. And I just thought, oh, I've earned my money. I actually didn't get paid for working with her. But, and two last slides. What do? You know, don't be afraid to spend time observing children, because it should be the start of everything you do. And I mean really observing. I made my job so that I could go into a school and I could spend the entire morning, if necessary, with a notepad and a pen, observing the child and scribbling my questions. And if I couldn't talk to the child themselves, talk to the teacher, the classroom aides, the support team, like the therapists, whoever was there. You know, observation, it's so important. And what can you do isn't the starting point. That's where you start to intervene to elicit responses. It's very much a teacher question. Can I get you to the threshold of these skills to get a baseline? But that's not where it starts. It starts with, who are you? And I find out who you are by what you do. And I see it's 9:30, and here's my last slide. This is my email address, welshgold@gmail.com. And I've got a lot of time on my hands at the moment because I haven't been anywhere for 5 weeks. So if you do email me, you may well get a response. It's a good time for email. I hope that was helpful. If it's left you more confused than you were before, then have a look at the articles in the reading list and contact me if you want to. And the one thing I haven't said that we all need is good luck, because we all need that as well. Thank you.